biggest jump that we see here, or that I've seen from looking at these budgets, is the likes of the Frisian Bullock. Last year, €1.90 to €2 was buying that, 450, 480 kilo Frisian Bullock. This year, he's €3.92 a kilo to buy, which is up €1.92 a kilo. So that's a massive jump for those Frisian type cattle. So it is.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan and I'm joined by Teagasc Beef Specialist David Argue to discuss beef markets, budgets and top tips for the months ahead. David, you're very welcome. Can you give an insight into 2025 markets and the trends you've seen so far?
The latest beef figures show, we'll say, a kill of just over 30,000 head of cattle were slaughtered, we'll say, at the weekend until the 20th of September 2025. The last time, we'll say, that weekly factory cattle supplies exceeded 30,000 head was, we'll say, the last week of April back earlier on in the year. This time last year, weekly factory cattle supplies were heading for 40,000 head, and the weekly kill numbers have been running behind ever since July, Catherine. So currently, we'll say the most noticeable drop-off is in the steer category, with just under 14,000 steers slaughtered last week compared to almost 19,000 slaughtered, we'll say, in the same week last year. And to date, we're down about 90 to 91,000 head of cattle compared to last year, so we are.
Significant changes, David, compared to this time last year. You mentioned there in the past week there has been a rise in beef supply again.
Yeah, so look, I suppose the weather just came, I suppose, at the right time or the wrong time, Catherine. So look, the weather did play a big part, we'll say, in the number of cattle coming available for slaughter. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen ground get very wet, and farmers that would have typically killed cattle off grass, they made the decision to slaughter these cattle sooner. We'll say sooner than putting them in, or we'll say, or continue to feed at grass under poor conditions. Cattle this year, we'll say, have done a great thrive, so they have all year, and they're a good bit ahead of last year's cattle, we'll say, condition wise. So there wasn't as big a need to hold on and feed as much, so there wasn't. A good proportion, we'll say, of the spring 2023 born cattle are coming up on 30 months of age now, these days or these weeks, and I suppose farmers are looking to get them slaughtered to be fit to avail of the higher QA prices in the factories. And then I suppose, look at the third thing that's resulting in a wee bit more of a supply is the number of cull cows. We'll say on many suckler farms there, cows have been scanned. Any cows that's not in calf, or any cows maybe that may not have been put back to the bull for various different reasons, they're coming out now. We'll say farmers maybe want to get them off the farm, reduce the amount of grass, and they're not going to be rehoused again. So they're all adding to the supply of cattle, we'll say, for this week. So there.
And there has been some decline in prices in the last few weeks, David, which is reflected in the base quotes from major factories around the country.
There has been, absolutely, Catherine. We've seen there, 4 or 5 weeks ago, we've seen prices there, well up over €8 when all bonuses and everything else was added in. And they're back quite a bit there, and have been dropping for the last 3 weeks or so across the country. At the minute, I suppose we see, the likes of our steers in around that $7.15, $7.20 a kilo. Heifers, we'll say, in spec $7.30 to $7.35 a kilo. We'll say the likes of the under 24-month bulls, we'll say for U-grading bulls, $7.40 to $7.50 a kilo has been paid for them at the moment. All grading bulls under 24 months, $7.30 to $7.40, and then we'll say your poorer quality, we'll say your O-grade cattle, they're back at $7.10 or $7.20 a kilo, and they're all on a flat price, we'll say, Catherine. There's no bonuses or no top-ups with them. If we take a look, we'll say at under 16-month bulls, they're in around that €7.20 mark on the grid. So we'll say we've 12% quality assurance on them, and then up the grid depending on the level of confirmation of them. The next category, I suppose, is cows, and cows is probably the one category we'll say that didn't get as big a hit in the last couple of weeks as we'll say prime cattle got. They seem to stay relatively steady. We'll take the likes there of a good U-grading cow at the moment. You're looking at maybe $7.20 or $7.30 a kilo for her. An all-grading cow, you're back at maybe €7 or $7.10, and then we'll say the O-grading cow, you're back at $6.80 or $6.90 a kilo for them. But one thing I will say, Catherine, is there's huge variation, with these meat plants across the country, and there's a big variation there. I would say from a price point of view, and it could be dependent on the weight, the fat score, the quality of these animals, but there does seem to be quite a variation in price available depending on what factory plant you're talking to.
You've done a number of budgets for different systems, and I suppose looking at no two farms or no two systems are the exact same. From your point of view, what should farmers consider now when they're completing their own finishing budgets?
Yeah, so look, I suppose the first thing we'd want to do is, we want to analyze the figures, and assess what system suits your farm best. There's a massive increase, we'll say, in the cost of buying these animals compared to last year. We see, prices there for weanlings, €1,000 above and beyond what was paid for them last year. So there is an awful lot more money involved and tied up with buying these animals this year. I suppose when the animals are bought, I suppose you want to look at the level of silage that'll be needed in the system, and the amount of meal is going to have to go into the system. And it does take quite a bit of money to be available to keep that system going. We'll say from buying now to selling, we'll say let it be next spring or next autumn. It does take quite a bit of money to be available there to keep those meal bills and whatnot paid. There's other bits and pieces needs to be taken into consideration as well, Catherine, the likes of your transport and levies, your vet costs and so on, and they can range from the likes of €15 to €40 depending on the system. Let it be a short-term keep or a long-term keep with the animals, and then the likes of your transport and levies, again, look, it could be up on €40. The other thing I suppose you want to look at is it is very farm specific, and that is the level of fixed costs on the farm. So obviously the higher the fixed costs, the greater the overall cost of the system is going to be, which in turn will result in a higher price needed at the other end when these animals are being sold.
And from the beef budgets, David, that you've combined together, there's a number of finishing scenarios. The prices for weanlings are good this autumn. How are stores or weanling prices comparing this year compared to other years?
So I just have from completing the budgets there a couple of weeks ago, Catherine, I just have, we'll say, the 2024 prices and the 2025 prices of these different animals. And until you see them on a page, it really does highlight the increase in price of these different categories of animals. So I suppose first of all, if we take the likes of that young bull system, last year, the general price for those young bulls, the better quality of them was, we'll say, in around that $340 to $350 a kilo was buying, the better end of them. This year, Catherine, will say in 2025, those animals are up well over €6 a kilo. Like we're looking at $635, $640 a kilo there, so we are for the same type of animal as last year. And that's up €2.92 a kilo from one year to the next. We'll say we'll take the next step back in the bull wean, and we'll say just slightly lesser quality, but still look at a good continental type calf. You're looking at maybe $330 or $340 a kilo. Last year was buying that calf. This year you're looking at maybe €6, €6.10 a kilo. So again, you're up €2.67 a kilo. We'll say the heifer calf in that system last year $312 was buying that heifer calf. This year it's €5.67, so we're up €2.55. So, I suppose the biggest jump we see is within the weanling systems. Let it be the weanling bull or the weanling heifer. Those prices have risen from $2.55 to €3 a kilo from last year to this year, and that is kind of reflected in the price. We've talked about this €1,000 more being paid this year for weanlings as opposed to last year, so that kind of reflects back on that. So it does. We'll say when we take a look at the more forward store, the heavier type animal, we'll say the store heifer or the store bullock. We'll say the continental store heifer last year, €3 between €3 and €3.10 was being paid for those 450 to 500 kilo heifers last year, whereas this year, look at $4.75, $4.80 has been paid for them. So we're up $1.70 or $1.75 a kilo. Now look at, we know that there is more than $4.75 paid for some of these heifers in the mart. Maybe some of these fancier type bull and heifers are going to make a lot more, but the general run of the mill, the feeding heifer, you're looking at $4.75 a kilo, which is up about $1.70 or $1.80 on last year's price. The likes of our store bullocks, so we'll say, for example, that 500 kilo store bullock that some farmers are buying now, we'll say, the likes of the continental bullock, $2.75 last year was the average price paid for that bullock. This year he's $4.83, so you're up over €2 a kilo on last year for that bullock. The likes of the Hereford and Angus, we'll say the dairy cross, $2.45 a kilo was buying them last year, and they've took a jump of $1.76 up to €4.21 this year. And I suppose, Catherine, the biggest jump that we see here, or that I've seen from looking at these budgets, is the likes of the Frisian bullock. Last year, $1.90 to €2 was buying that 450, 480 kilo Frisian bullock. This year he's €3.92 a kilo to buy, which is up €1.92 a kilo. So that's a massive jump for those Frisian type cattle. So it is. The last thing that I looked at, we'll say in the systems was the dairy calf to beef, the dairy calf, the runner system. Last year, the likes of your bull calf or heifer calf was being bought about that €2.80, €2.90, maybe €3 a kilo with a push. This year they're well over €5, 5.20, 5.30 a kilo. So they're up, we say, at 2.35 to 2.40 a kilo from last year's price. So all in all, all categories have taken a quite a big jump. But we'll say the continental bull weanling or the continental heifer weanling has most certainly taken a big jump this year. So we have.
And for the purposes of the budgets that you completed, what did you see when it comes to the costs?
The costs haven't changed a whole lot from last year, Catherine. Meal is fairly similar to the prices of last year. It might have been slightly higher in the springtime, but it has come back now, we'll say, in the autumn time. Fertilizer prices haven't changed a whole lot either, so they haven't. So the costs haven't really changed a whole lot. But we'll say for the likes of those young bull systems, we'll take, for example, buying a 400 kilo young bull now, killing them next June. We'll say, the total cost associated with him, when you count in meal, silage, your vet bills, your level of fixed costs and whatnot, you're looking at about €1,000.50 to bring that animal through, we'll say, on a total cost. So that's variable cost and fixed costs combined. We'll take a look at the continental weanling bull calf. Buying him in now, taking him right through until, we'll say, January or February 2027. So he's got 2 winters and a summer ahead of him. You're looking at in the region of €1,215 to bring him right through. We'll say that period of time. The likes of the heifer calf, buying her in now 280 kilos. The variable cost is about 570. Fixed cost, you're looking at about 170. So a total cost there of about €740 to bring her right through, we'll say, till next October, and killing that heifer off grass next October. We'll say the likes of the store bullock, the autumn to autumn system, which is always a very common and a very popular system. Buying in the likes of those continental store bullocks now and grazing, we'll say, housing them for 1 winter inside in the shed and grazing them next summer and killing them the end of next summer under 30 months. The biggest cost in that system, I suppose, and in these next 3 systems that we're going to talk about, we'll say the continental steer, the Angus, the Hereford, and then the Frisian steer. The biggest cost associated with that system is silage. So look, it has taken roughly about €850 or €60 to we're saying costs for that continental system, and roughly around €800, between €780 and €800 for the Angus and Hereford and the Frisian, to bring them right through to beef next year. And then we'll say the likes of the runners, we'll say the dairy beef runners, the heifers and the bullocks. Look at the steers, I suppose, they're being bought in now and no more than the continental weanling. They're going to be wintered for a winter now, graze next summer, and slaughter the following winter out of the shed. So it's costing quite a bit to bring them right through. So you're looking at about €1,010 between variable and fixed costs, and about €710 for the heifers, assuming that we're killing them next autumn off grass.
A huge amount of information there, David, across the different systems. For farmers that are considering purchasing weanlings and stores now and bringing them on to finish, what would you say are the key things from completing those budgets? What would you say are the key things that they need to consider?
Look at, I suppose the first thing we want to be looking at is the general health of the animals, and making sure that they're healthy, these cattle that we're buying. As I said earlier on, we see these prices, of the animals at the moment, and they're well above €1,000 what they were last year. So look, it's important that we're buying animals that are healthy and are going to go on and thrive quite well for us. So look, I suppose from a health point of view, obviously we're looking at animals that have they're bright of the eye, and they're showing good signs of alertness. Obviously we want to have animals that are clean of the nose and no nasal discharge or coughing, which may indicate signs of sickness. Look, at ideally when we're in the market or wherever we're buying these animals, if we can ask the person to sell them, what they're vaccinating for or what they've been vaccinated with, when last they were dosed or whatnot, it will give us a good idea of the history of the health of these animals. And then I suppose, animals that are bought, we'll say let it be in March or again on privately on the country, we'll say, bringing these animals home and, putting them into a level of quarantine there for a couple of weeks to make sure they're in and settled, and that if they do have any issues that they can overcome them before they mix with any other animals on the farm. I suppose then as well, have a health plan in place in your own farm, when it comes to buying these animals in. Weanlings could be coming from a multiple of different sources. So it's important to try and have them on the same vaccine program, with the same dosing plan that's on your own farm, which will greatly help reduce, the level of pneumonia or disease or sickness outbreaks on the farm. Another thing that's available there at the moment, Catherine, for men that's buying these wheelings or store cattle in the market at the moment, the CBV, or the commercial beef value, is now available. So looking at that, and that'll give a good idea as to the genetic potential these animals have and what they could potentially generate on the farm. We'll say later on. And I suppose then the biggest thing, Catherine, then is looking at the overall costs to give a bit of an insight as to what it's going to take these animals from buying now until selling. That'll be next spring or later on next summer off grass, or whatever the case may be.
And finally, David, what are the key considerations for farmers at this stage in the year that are selling weanlings in the coming weeks? What should they be aware of?
Yeah, so look, I suppose, Catherine, we see a lot of suckler farmers at the moment that are breeding these weanlings. A lot of them are part of the beef welfare scheme, so there. So as being involved in the scheme, I suppose there's a couple of different requirements. So the first one, I suppose, is the farmers are required to have their calves weaned properly before selling them. So in doing that, the farmer, he has a requirement there of meal feeding calves for 4 weeks pre-weaning and 2 weeks post-weaning before they're sold. Another part of that scheme, or another element of that scheme, is, we'll say, the vaccination part of it. And, farmers can select to vaccinate their calves for pneumonia or Clostridial diseases. So making sure that the calves have been vaccinated properly before they're being sold is very important. And as I've said, Catherine, a few times on this podcast, we do know the value of these animals are up greatly on last year. And there's an awful lot more money involved in buying a pen or 2 pens of animals this year. So look, we have to be careful as well, when selling these weanlings, and we want to ensure that we're carrying out the best practices possible for the farmers or the exporters or whoever are buying these weanlings, because there is an awful lot more money involved this year as opposed to last year.
That's great. Thanks very much, David.
No problem at all, Catherine. And look, at just we say the budgets that I discussed there, they're all available online at teagasc.ie. And if any farmers have any other questions or queries, they're welcome to contact their local advisor to go through the figures and analyse them further.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to David for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.